Good morning, it's day 3 of our Lent readings for 2022 and we're going to be looking at Mark's Gospel today. Mark is the shortest, 16 chapters long, and together with Matthew and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels as they're known, have a lot of passages in common. Now it's often thought that Mark was written first and that Luke and Matthew used it as a resource in writing theirs. And reason being that Mark's Greek is pretty poor, but Luke and Matthew's is better, and it would normally be assumed that you would take some poor quality document and write and improve it, make corrections in your own text rather than the other way round. So it's often thought that Mark's was the first gospel, though they could all really use the same resource, and just Mark copied it literally where the others tidied it up. Mark's is a very action-packed gospel. As well as focusing more on what Jesus did rather than what he said, he frequently uses words like suddenly and immediately. Mark is thought to have been the person mentioned in Acts who went on mission with Paul. You might remember the account. Paul takes Mark with him on a missionary journey, but Mark soon turns back and deserts Paul and Barnabas. And that ends up causing a bit of trouble later on. But if you get to the end of Paul's life and the letters he wrote later on, like Colossians and Philemon and 2 Timothy, Mark gets mentioned as being useful to Paul. So there'd been some reconciliation and probably some maturity had taken place by that time. The thought is that Mark later worked with Peter, and Peter is in Rome near the end of his life, and Mark is writing down Peter's recollections of his time with Jesus, and that is part of the basis of this gospel. And there are clues there to be in an eyewitness account. There's a few little details aren't mentioned in other gospels, like at the feeding of the 5,000, it just happens to mention the grass being green. In the passage I'll read in a moment, it talks about other boats being there as well. And there's this an account in Gethsemane, at the arrest of Jesus, where a young man runs leaving a cloak behind. These are details not elsewhere included, and I suggest this is written at least partly from an eyewitness point of view. Now yesterday, in finishing Matthew, with the end of Matthew's, the Great Commission, which starts that Jesus says all authority had been given to him. I want to pick up on that idea of authority of Jesus and just look at that a bit in Mark today. So we're going to read from chapter 4 and we're going to read from verse 35, a well-known story of the stilling of the storm. So let's read together. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, he took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind and the waves, and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this, that even the wind and waves obey him?" Jesus had been teaching all day by the shore and had pushed out into a boat to teach the crowd from a boat. It must have been a tiring day, and at the end of the day he says, "Let's go across the lake," maybe just to escape the crowds. And so they push out, and later that evening this storm comes up. A storm so powerful that even experienced fishermen start to fear for their lives. And Jesus is asleep. So they wake him up and say, "Lord, don't you care if we drown?" You see, they're already started to think differently about Jesus. Earlier he'd been the great teacher, but now they're saying, "Lord, don't you care?" It was his idea after all to cross over the lake. And then Jesus stands up. He turns to the wind and tells it to be still. He turns to the waves and tells them to be quiet. And calmness is restored. One moment, those disciples are fearing because of the storm. But now they turn and look at Jesus, and they're even more afraid and says, "Who is he that even the wind and waves obey him?" Now, that question itself we'll look at a bit more tomorrow, that idea of who is Jesus. But just in this narrative, they see Jesus do something that in the Old Testament the only one that controlled the wind and waves was God. And they stand in awe because they suddenly see his authority. And when Mark puts this gospel together, he puts 4 stories in a row. This story is followed by the man who was possessed by a legion of demons. And then we have the story of the woman who had bleeding, and then Jairus' daughter. And those 4 stories in a row talk of the authority of Jesus. For Jesus here has authority over the wind and the waves of creation. Then with the man possessed by a legion of demons, Jesus has authority over the spiritual realm. And then with the woman who has bleeding, Jesus has authority over sickness. And finally with Jairus' daughter, he has authority even over death itself. All authority is given to him. Until next time, have a blessed